Hello everybody and welcome to our next lectures. Thus far in the course, we've considered church and state and the people who populated the church, the church men and the church women. So we've looked at priests, we've looked at bishops, we've looked at monks and nuns and to an extent novices. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the wide variety of practices and beliefs that existed among the people. And by the people, in this sense, I generally mean the rural peasantry and the lower classes of Russian society. Of course, some of these beliefs were shared by more, how should we say it, highly ranked or more socially prestigious individuals. But such beliefs among these higher classes were tending to die off throughout the 18th, 19th century, although there were some revivals certainly at various points. So generally today our focus of attention will be the peasantry and will be their practices and their belief systems. In some cases, these were explicitly authorized, sponsored, and indeed required by the Holy Synod and by Russian imperial law. In other cases, the situation was much more ambiguous, and in some cases, these were practices that went practices and beliefs that went directly against the policies and legal establishments of the Synod and the imperial government. But I would like to start with a sort of warning for this lecture. And this is about, and this can be said to apply to the historical study of religion as a whole. When we encounter these beliefs, these practices, many of them, I'm sure, seem strange, indeed alien, to us in the modern sort of 21st, in the 21st century. And it is very tempting to assign our modern value systems, our modern judgments, our modern conceptions to these past practices. It's very tempting to label them as superstitious, ignorant, false, and a variety of other epithets we might use to otherwise discredit how these people conceived of the world and how these people acted within the world. As historians, however, we are required to take a different approach. We do not have to say that a belief system is true or false. We have to take it, in a sense, as it is. We have to suggest, well, these people believed in, let's say, in witches. They believed that some people possessed magical or superhuman abilities that enabled them to influence events, people, communities for good or for bad. And our job isn't to condemn this or to label it, or to condemn or label it, or to assign our modern value conceptions of it. Our job is to try and understand the web of systems of thinking, of systems of belief, how those connected with social, political, cultural contexts. Because in many cases, if we do so, we find that these views, these beliefs, these actions start to make a great deal more sense. They have to be taken within these contexts, within these terms, not judged by modern standards. And I think, this is a valuable lesson for all of you who are studying, in the theology department here at the University of Tartu, to keep in mind. When you study a religion or a religious belief from an academic perspective, whether it is true or not is not the main concern. We are academics. Our efforts are not to our job is not to arrive at the conclusion of whether this is true or not. It is to try and understand and explain. That is our principal job. And I want you to keep this in mind throughout this lecture, because we are going to encounter today, I think, a fair few beliefs, a fair few actions, which to us seem inexplicable. Perhaps inexplicably grotesque, inexplicably violent, or inexplicably unsuccessful, inexplicably false. But my job today is to try and guide you through this, to try and show you in the context in which these belief systems made sense, and in the belief systems in which they operated. Okay, so here is, just give you a very famous sort of portrait of a popular religious practice, sort of an icon procession. And it's one of the things today we're going to encounter. So, but let's first start then with the church and its parishioners. How does the official institution of the church relate to parishioners, and vice versa? How do parishioners relate to the official institution of the church? Well, the main way in which the church organizes its parishioners is, perhaps not surprisingly, in parishes. The parish is the basic unit, the basic institution of the vast majority of Christian churches, and the Orthodox Church in the Russian Empire and elsewhere is certainly no exception. And by 1917, there were a great many of these parishes. So there are 50,000 of them. And what is the parish? Well, the parish basically is the smallest unit of church administration. It is usually going to be defined by the presence of a parish priest and a parish church. These are the two sort of, and the community formed around that church and around that priest is the parish. Now, that is the most basic definition, the most basic example of a parish. A church in a village, and that village's priest. But of course, this is human history. Very few things are that simple or that uniform. And in the Russian Empire in particular, parishes did not necessarily resemble this sort of ideal model. For instance, in Siberia, in the vast spaces of Siberia, communities could be, parishes could be spread out among several villages, each of which was many, many kilometers distant from each other. It could therefore, this of course might obstruct the travel of this might require the travel of the priest, who might have to go over great distances to advise, to consult, to perform the rituals for his spiritual children, and conversely, for spiritual children to travel to the parish church to conduct their legally required minimum of a confession and a Eucharist a year. So these trips could take a vast amount of time, and so essentially parishes could be highly dispersed units covering many, many kilometers with many different settlements attached to one parish church. It depended very heavily on the area of the Russian Empire we're talking about. A further point to note, that although the parish is an administrative unit of the church, it is not a legal unit in the state. As far as the state is concerned, the parish has no rights. It cannot acquire property of its own. It cannot act as a body in law courts, etc., etc. The legal body, as far as the state is concerned, is the church as a whole. And it is the synod who essentially owns and governs these parishes and represents them legally in front of the Russian state. Now you have to imagine why this could be a problem. Well, basically it's the fact that the synod controls the ability of these parishes to, for instance, acquire new property. The synod in St. Petersburg is the one governing how these parishes are run through the mediation and consultation of the diocesan bishop and his consistory. This means that parishioners have very little legal control over buildings, over institutions, which they regard as community property, and which are treated as community property, which are built on their money, with their money, which are beautified with their money. The icons inside are bought with their money. The bells are bought with their money. The salary of the priest is mostly paid with their money. But yet they have very limited amount of control over what that parish can do, because the parish itself is not a legal entity. Now, of course, the parish does have forms of representation which allow the parishioners to express their interests in front of the local priest and indeed in front of the diocesan authorities, principally the bishop and the consistory. The major way in which this is done is through the institution of the church elder. So normally parishioners will come together to elect one or perhaps two elders whose job it will be to sort of manage community funds for the church, to take care of the buildings, to assist the priest in some administrative work, to join the parish council and contribute to decisions in how the parish is run. Often, of course, to no one's surprise, the people being elected to be parish elders are senior male representatives of the community, often the rather more economically successful or socially well-placed peasants who already possessed a degree of authority, a degree of social prestige within their communities. And there were parish councils as well, bodies which again were chosen by the parishioners, which essentially attempted to mediate between parishioners and the priest to try and, for instance, present demands from the priest to parishioners and vice versa to present parishioner demands to the priest. And of course also a parish council might have to send petitions to the diocesan authorities or indeed to the Holy Synod to try essentially acting on behalf of the entire parish to galvanize action from various institutions of authority. Now, as for the number of these parishioners, now by 1897, there were 129 million of them scattered across the entirety of the Russian Empire. As we already discussed, the relationship between the priest and his parishioners was complicated and indeed exacerbated by the financial condition of the clergy. As you may remember from 2 lectures ago, the clergy, for the most part of the imperial period, did not receive a salary. And even when they did start receiving salaries in the late imperial period, these salaries were often inadequate. This meant they were often dependent on their parishioners for financial support. They received from their parishioners, for instance, land which they and their families could farm, and then they could presumably sell the produce or live off the produce. They provided money for the parishioners would pay for the performance of certain religious ceremonies and rituals, for instance, a wedding, a funeral, a baptism, blessing a house with holy water. The list goes on. And of course, and to a certain extent, parishioners were required to. Sometimes parishioners were required to provide housing for their priest, and so on and so forth. So this, but yet, despite the fact that the parishioners were mostly paying for the priest was ultimately not responsible to them, at least not in an administrative sense. Perhaps in a moral one he might have been, but certainly not in an administrative one, where he was essentially regarded, he was the direct junior of the bishop, and therefore the direct junior of the Holy Synod. He was expected to carry out the orders of the Synod, regardless of whether the community that was paying for him, wanted those orders or not. And of course, this creates a great deal of tension between priests and parishioners. On the one hand, priests often record sort of the degrading practice of having to essentially barter with the peasants, to haggle, to negotiate with the peasants over the cost of services, over the amount of land provided, over the amount of labor given, and so on and so forth. And of course, entering in such economic relations doesn't exactly heighten the religious, the spiritual authority of the priest. On the other hand, and coming from what I just said, you could see that certainly, peasants would be dissatisfied that a priest who they pay for, to a large extent, does not fulfill their wishes, but rather fulfills the wishes of a very distant and seldom seen bishop, or the practically invisible and very abstract authority of the Holy Synod in St. Petersburg. However, I do also want to underline, although there were tensions, of course, it is difficult to perceive in Russian society, at least in Russian peasant society, widespread anti-clericalism, by which I mean dislike, hatred, and even the desire perhaps for the abolition of the clergy as a group. We don't really see that. We generally see individualized trouble between parishioners and priests, often arising over a particular dispute, of course frequently focused around money, but also on other issues and matters where the peasants wanted something and the priest opposed them, or vice versa. It could be, for instance, that the peasants, wanted a particular set of icons in the church, and the priest opposed this. Therefore, tensions broke out. People started complaining to the authority figures about each other. Potentially, situations became so severe that that priests had to move, or that relationships were permanently soured. But generally speaking, these are individual, personal cases of tension. It is not a manifestation of a dislike of priests as a group, of priests as such. And indeed, we can tell from when communities lacked priests, they absolutely, and with great fervour, declared to the Holy Synod the need for a priest. The priest was a part of the community, and the priest's role as a teacher, especially later, and also as someone who performed the rituals, performed the sacred rituals, which made up such a part of the peasant spiritual mindset. The priests were necessary to the peasants, and they certainly fought so. In other words, I want to make this clear: the vast majority of peasants in the Russian Empire, throughout the period we're discussing, perhaps with the exception of the last few years of the Russian Empire, did not want to get rid of priests as a group. They might want to get rid of an individual priest, replacing him with someone who was more amenable, who was more respectable, who was better behaved, etc., etc. But they did not dispute overall the need for priests within their communities and within their religious lives. Talking of religious lives, it is the Church's rituals are important not simply as we go into, from a religious perspective, not from a theological perspective certainly, and not only from a spiritual perspective or within the sort of context of the magical world of the Russian peasantry, but as a structure, as a series of ceremonies giving structure to an individual's life and to the life of a community. The rituals of the Russian Orthodox Church mark several points of passage in an individual's life. At birth, one is baptized. In youth, one is administered charismation. One is married in the church. Your children are baptized. And when you die, you are buried according to the funeral rites of the Orthodox Church. All of these rituals mark key turning points in an individual's development. They, in other words, give structure to an individual's life as they go from infancy into adulthood to death. Now, the single most important ritual, not only, of course, in Russian Orthodoxy, but I would probably say in most forms of Christianity, was the Eucharist, or otherwise known as the Mass. That is to say, the ritual performed where the priest mysteriously and miraculously transforms the wine and bread into the body and blood of Christ. Now, as I've said many times in this course, and I can assure you I'm probably going to say many times after this, this ritual was not only just important spiritually, it was important legally. One was required to take the Eucharist once a year. Why was this the case? Well, it wasn't simply a matter of ensuring Orthodox Christians kept up with their faith and so on and so forth. It was an administrative matter. When you took the Eucharist, you would sign your name and give your data in the church's confessional books. And that data was then transmitted to the consistory, who further transmitted it to the synod, who then transmitted it to the other organs of government. The Eucharist is not just, of course, a spiritual, liturgical act, it is an administrative one. One which allows the church to act as a data collecting body for not just the church, but for the imperial government. Now, to us today, it seems odd. I think for anyone who is religious, there tends to be an idea of, well, one goes to church on Sunday regularly, once a week. And to us, this sort of this requirement to go once a year, well, it seems a legal bare minimum. But this again is a reflection of a modern way, a modern form of religious worship. This is not how things occurred in the 19th century. In fact, once a year was more than sufficient for most at least most pious Orthodox believers. Why is that the case? Because they had took taking the confession and taking the sacraments seriously. This is not something to do lightheartedly. You don't go out for a binge on vodka and beer on Saturday and then go take confession with your body polluted by a sinful liquid. No, you have to prepare rigidly to take these legally mandated sacraments. You have to fast, that is to say, give up food, or give up certain kinds of food. You have to abstain from sex, abstain from alcohol. To prepare yourself to be worthy of receiving the body and blood of Christ the Saviour. And so indeed, it is perhaps a mark of how seriously peasants took the ritual of the sacrament of the Eucharist. It is the fact they only took it once a year. In other words, this is not a marker of indifference or laxity, but rather a sign of the strictness with which they approach this religious duty. And it's therefore unsurprising that most people chose to take their legally mandated Eucharist on the major Christian holiday of Easter, the holiday marking the resurrection of Jesus Christ. A long fast preceded that holiday. It was probably the most natural time to take the sacrament. And the church, by the way, until about towards the end of the 19th century, largely agreed with this kind of approach, largely agreed with the idea that taking the sacraments is not something to be done lightheartedly every week, regardless of what you'd been doing in the previous week. It was something to be taken seriously, something to be prepared for, both bodily and spiritually. Now, talking of fasting is a very dominant form of religious behavior in the Russian Empire. Certainly is not one just limited to peasants and the lower orders of society. The Russian Orthodox Church, then and today, has a great number of periods in the calendar which are official fasting periods. These are periods in when you are supposed to abstain from certain types of food, certain types of drink. In other words, to lead a pure life, a life much more oriented towards Jesus Christ's example of living humbly, of living without luxury, of living simply. The most important, as I've just mentioned, of these fast periods was that which preceded Easter, the 6 week-long Great Lent, Veliki Post in Russian. And there are other more minor ones throughout the year. Now, fasting did indeed come under criticism in the later 19th century and early 20th from some individuals who claim that the sort of Russian obsession with fasting was one of the reasons for malnutrition, was again a symbol of superstition over rational thinking. Of course, it's difficult to say whether truly fasting was a cause for Russia's high extent of malnutrition. I personally don't think so. I think poverty and general famines have much more to do with the issue. But in any case, these were some of the arguments that were made towards the end of the 19th and early 20th century, that Orthodox fasting was excessive, and that some peasants, some people only regarded the Orthodox faith as equivalent to fasting. They believed that fasting was the only element of orthodox behavior that they needed to conduct in order to be considered a pious individual. Well, in other words, criticizing people for extremely superstitious and superficial views on their religion. Now, what about in the church? I mean, what could a parishioner do in their community church? And the answer in the Orthodox case is, well, not a great deal. There is no question that within most ceremonies in a Russian Orthodox church, the priest or priests is the central figure. He is the person who gives the sermon. He is the person who is able, through his ordination, that is the sacrament conducted in order to make him a priest, through that ordination, he is allowed to perform sacraments himself. And through that through that ability to perform the sacraments, his role is fundamentally central in the church. Parishioners, to a large extent, are observers of the priests. They are not really actively getting involved in the ceremony. Later, especially towards the end of the 19th century, parish choirs tend to be are being founded more and more often, which at least prefer the opportunity to parishioners to sing in the church, to celebrate their faith, to celebrate the holy sacraments that they're witnessing through song and through music. But to a large extent, even beyond 1917, parishioners in the Orthodox Church's rituals and liturgies have a very, very limited role. This is accentuated by the fact that it was indeed difficult. It would have been difficult on a practical level for parishioners to have gotten actively involved in these ceremonies. For one thing, the liturgy and much of the music, many of the rituals of the church were not performed in modern Russian. They were performed in Old Church Slavonic, basically a form of medieval Bulgarian. And certainly, while there were some words and some grammar that was recognizable to parishioners, certainly the entirety of the surface itself would have made very little sense. Russian efforts to translate the Bible from Old Church Slavonic, knowledge of which was mostly limited to priests or to people belonging to people with a church education. Russian efforts to translate the Bible from Old Church Slavonic into modern Russian went very, very, very slowly. Partially because there was no agreement. I mean, I won't go into the full story, but there was basically very little agreement on which texts to use as the basis for translation, whether the translation should be as literal as possible or more figurative, who should be publishing the translation, who should be the translators, etc., etc. There are a whole host of problems involved with translation. Basically, the first time an entire Bible appeared in modern Russian was in 1875. 1875. It's an astonishingly late date. There had been translations of the New Testament, while in the 18th century, the so-called Empress Elizabeth Bible, the Russian Bible Society, run by mostly British Protestant missionaries operating in St. Petersburg in the early 19th century, had translated and published the New Testament. But an entire Bible officially endorsed by the Synod did not appear until 1875. When we come to looking at religious dissidents, this is one reason for their success. Because religious dissidents, firstly, they encouraged the participation of parishioners in the ceremonies. They took a very active role in the ceremonies. And secondly, of course, the services in these sort of distant churches were done in modern Russian, an understandable language. There were various trends, by the way, in the Orthodox Church, there were various trends, especially appearing in the beginning of the 20th century, within the Church who argued for the translation of the service into modern Russian, the main services into modern Russian, the abandonment of Old Church Slavonic. Basically, this was discredited in the 1920s by a systematic movement, and even today, the Russian Orthodox Church still uses, for the vast majority of cases, Old Church Slavonic in its major liturgical rituals. What then about the framework for all of these, the physical framework for all of these people and for all of these behaviors? Well, that was, of course, mostly the church building itself. Now, this is not only a community hub, a place where the vast majority of the community will assemble at various times. It is also something on a spiritual level. It is a gateway to the mystical and the divine. I think I've asked you before to imagine, and I will ask you again to imagine, the sort of the world of the Russian peasant village in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's not a particularly pleasant place. It's full of illness, pain, disease, family quarrels, quarrels with neighbors, economic disputes. It's a world that largely doesn't have many forms of entertainment, of color, of display. And then you have the church, beautifully painted, sitting above it all, often one of the only buildings in the village made of stone. The insides often covered in gold, precious jewelry, icons, the sound of singing around you. This mystical language, which you don't quite understand, chanting in the background, incense filling your nostrils. It is certainly a portal to a different world for many of the peasants. And they certainly understood it as such, or at least they treated the church as an extremely important building in their communities. It was the focus of community efforts, of community spending, of community building. It was a matter of community pride to transform your church from a wooden one into a stone one, to fill it full of beautiful icons, framed in silver and gold, with jewels all around. Peasant communities were certainly not afraid of spending hundreds, thousands of rubles on upgrading the appearance of their church. And as I've just explained, of course, this is because it is a community centre. It is potentially a centre of entertainment on one level, but it is also a centre of spirituality, of the sense of something above the horrors, the mediocrity, the greyness of everyday life. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, of course, there were some people who were too distant from the parish church to be able to go there regularly. This is especially the case in Siberia, where some villages, part of a parish, would be many, many kilometers away from their church. And at certain times of the year, especially in the spring, when the snow and ice melted creating sudden rivers, muddy tracks, etc., etc. It was very difficult to access the parish church. And the solution for this was chapels. These were not churches. What they typically were small buildings. You can see I've given you a picture here as an example. Although this is a rather ornate chapel, in my opinion, they could be much humbler, sort of small shacks made of wood, really. And they were intended to allow people to go see icons, worship in a setting that was somewhat holy, without going all the way to the parish church. And equally, the parish priest might be able to travel to those chapels at an appointed time, meet his parishioners from more distant parishes, and conduct the service in one of these chapels. Now, of course, on the one hand, undoubtedly the synod and the episcopal hierarchy like the fact that peasants took such care of their churches and their chapels, spending so much money on their beautification and construction. But on the other hand, from the synod's perspective, it could be considered a waste. From the synod's perspective, there were more pressing financial concerns that the parish should address, particularly that of the salaries of the clergy, of providing the clergy with the necessary money they needed to exist. Thus, this is one area where we find certain conflicts between parishioners on one hand and priests, bishops, and the synod on the other, is precisely disputes over allowing for beautification, allowing the construction of stone churches, allowing the construction of chapels, and so on and so forth. The synod regarded that there were perhaps better uses for the money. Parishioners, for whom the church or the chapel was the centre of their community and spiritual lives, thought differently. And of course, you can see here, this is a conflict of two different worldviews, really, not just a conflict over money, it's a conflict of two different worldviews. This is a conflict of the synod, a largely bureaucratic, pan-imperial institution, which deals with things like budgets, is responsible for the well-being of the empire's clergy, and an individual community, on the other hand, which desires to not only beautify and celebrate its religious centre, but also to raise its own esteem and prestige. There is a battle here between an administrative, pan-imperial, largely bureaucratic institution and the mentality of community religious life ongoing in these kind of struggles. Another event which involved the entire community were cross processions. These were regular events throughout the Russian Empire, not simply in rural communities, but also in towns, cities, which could be held to mark a huge variety of occasions. A cross procession could be held, for instance, in Russian capital because of a military victory, because a new bishop had been appointed and just arrived, because there was a particular, market in town. It could be held to mark the death or the birth of an emperor or the birth of a prince, Tsarevich. Cross processions are an almost universal manifestation of religiosity across the Russian Empire. Just to make clear, in case you're unaware, what is a cross procession? Well, basically, the priest goes in front. He's carrying a cross. He's usually dressed in his full clerical vestments, his full priestly clothing. And he's followed by his parishioners carrying banners, icons, various forms of religious paraphernalia. They're often praying, they're often singing, and they will often march around a particular route, a route with symbolic importance related to the event they are celebrating. Now, the most typical form of cross procession was that done usually once every few years around the borders of a parish. So the priest and the parishioners would march together to demark the limits of their religious community, where their religious community ended and another one began. So they carried icons, and icons bore the images of saints. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the institution of sainthood, just in case, firstly, in case you're unfamiliar with it in general, but also to introduce you to its particular Russian Orthodox context. So who or what was a saint? Well, a saint was somebody who, due to their piety in life, to their heroic actions, maybe due to their death in defense of the Christian religion, they were judged, because of these actions, they were judged to be people who had been elevated to sit at the hand of God, people who were God's special favorites, people with direct connection to God. And because of this, in their lives and also in their deaths, they had the potential to wield special powers to create miracles. Now in Russia, the two most popular saints, especially if we talk in terms of the number of icons produced, were undoubtedly first the Virgin Mary, so the mother of God, so the mother of Christ, and Saint Nicholas, the miracle worker. Indeed, some British visitors to Russia in the 18th century thought that Saint Nicholas was worshipped so widely and to such a great extent that the Russians believed Saint Nicholas was himself God, although, of course, that is incorrect. Different saints, as I'm sure you're aware, can perform different roles and can protect or be the patrons of various different groups or different localities. So, for instance, monasteries might have patron saints. Churches would be named after a particular saint, and the church would celebrate the saint's particular holy day. On a more abstract level, for instance, the patron saint of Moscow was Saint George, the dragon slayer, the warrior, in Russian known as Saint George, the victory bringer, a military saint, in other words. And there were a fair number of military saints, both in the Orthodox and, of course, in the Catholic canon of saints. One might also find Russian royalty among the various saints. So, for instance, Nicholas, let's start. So, often medieval Russian princes received sainthood. Saint Boris, and Saint Gleb, for instance, were two princes who were famous for having submitted humbly to a death at the hands of their dynastic rivals. You have people like Saint Dmitry Donskoy or Saint Alexander Nevsky, who were famed for their military actions against non-Orthodox enemies. And finally, at the beginning of the 21st century, the Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas II as a saint, judging his death in 1918 to be the equivalent of a martyrdom, a sacrifice done for the sake of the entirety of Russia, perhaps to remind them of their sins. I mean, you certainly don't have to agree with that interpretation. Many people do not, but that is what the Orthodox Church upholds. So how did one then become a saint? Well, the process is technically called canonization. A person is canonized. Now, in medieval Russia, due to the fact that there was virtually no church administration in any real terms, the number of canonizations proliferated beyond any sort of reasonable level. Hundreds of local Russian saints, some connected to some kind of reality, others absolutely divorced from reality and thoroughly based entirely in myth, came to be throughout this period. With many of them maintaining cults even to the present day. And some of them only being found in certain local areas. You could sometimes perhaps tell if you move from one local area to another to see the changes in who and who was not canonized as a saint. Well, this changes dramatically in 18th and 19th century Russia in the period of synodal orthodoxy, because the synod is very invested in who can and cannot be canonized. The synod does not want potentially embarrassing people to be canonized as saints, and so takes an extraordinarily thorough approach to investigating miracles. And I use the word extraordinarily advisedly. Investigations into saints, investigations into miracles attributed to holy people sometimes took years to complete, with investigation after investigation after investigation. The synod was very cautious for the simple fact that the world around it was was becoming increasingly scientific and increasingly skeptical of a notion of miracles and sainthood. And ergo, the church wanted to make as sure as it could, as possible, that these individuals, their miracles, were true, or as true as possibly could be said. And we're going to see more about this later, the synod's use of medical expertise in particular to investigate these kind of records, to try and make sure that they could be presented to members of secular society with a degree of scientific verification. And of course, I should also mention that the synod was aware that local communities were very eager to have their local holy man or holy woman recognized as a saint after death, because, well, such could be a valuable source of income. People would make pilgrimages, pay money in churches, buy local crafted items, and so on and so forth. So the synod was aware that there were many mercenary motives behind people applying for their local holy individual to be canonized as a saint. One of the main ways in which one worshipped the saints and received the grace of the saints was through their relics. The relics could be a variety of objects. Often they were body parts. I've given you here, this is a supposedly preserved hand of a saint. But they could also be clothing, objects that belonged to the saint, and so on and so forth. And these were usually stored with great honor. They were considered the treasures of churches, monasteries, and convents. these were the things that would draw in crowds of believers and bring in, of course, along with the crowds of believers, bring in money. And for people, these objects, these physical remains of these holy figures who now sat alongside God, who now had a direct connection to God, were holy. And they could transmit that holiness, often through touch, either by the fingers, or either by touching them, or by kissing them. Now, there was a slight contrast, a slight distinction in how the church viewed relics and how most of the Russian people viewed relics. The church, the people insisted, as a traditional belief, that the relics of a saint should be non-corrupted, should be incorrupted, uncorrupted. In other words, the body of the saint worshipped in the monastery should not have decayed after death. It should have been met by the particular holiness of that individual. It should be miraculously maintained. This, for most people, was a mark of true sainthood. However, the Orthodox Church's theological position on this was that incorruptibility was not required. As far as the Church theologically was concerned, the body could decay and a person could still be a saint, considered a saint. What mattered was the miracles the person had done in life and what miracles could be attributed after death, not the perfect preservation of the body. However, the Church was very aware of the popular belief regarding bodies. And certainly, they did include this in their investigations of sainthood as a criteria, because they knew this was a way in which others would recognize the sanctity of the individual concerned. So here I want to give you a very famous example from the 18th and 19th centuries of a canonization of a saint, of a Russian saint, that took place in the synodal period, more precisely took place at the beginning of the 20th century. This is Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who came from Tambov, lived in the late 18th and early 19th century, served basically as a spiritual elder to many, was considered wise, considered a knowledgeable person of the Gospels, and was regarded for his harsh, ascetic lifestyle, for denying himself the pleasures and comforts of life in exchange for an existence marked by pain and suffering in the name of Christ. Now, it was widely in Sarov and in the local region. His holiness was widely attested. Many miracles were reported from his body, from his appearances in dreams, from objects said to belong to him, etc., etc. And so, about 60 years after his death, the synod finally started investigations about whether Seraphim should be canonized as a saint. Although the investigation eventually came to the conclusion that 28 miracles could be attested to Seraphim, the synod was still extremely reluctant to go ahead with canonization. One factor was that they knew for a fact that the clergy in Tambov were very eager to see Seraphim canonized, because it would presumably mean an increase in revenues from them. Seraphim's popularity was quite large and quite widespread over the Russian Empire, and so therefore it was assumed he would attract pilgrims who would bring with them their wallets in order to pay for prayers, religious items, crucifixes, icons, etc., etc. So the synod was very cautious because it suspected, even though its own investigation had concluded that there were miracles that could be attested to Seraphim, it was still cautious because of the mercenary motives of the clergy involved. And really the only thing that changed the synod's mind was the fact that in 1902, Nicholas II, who had made a personal connection with the cult of Seraphim, ordered the synod to canonize him. This, by the way, was a tremendous intervention by the emperor into a matter that was purely considered a church one. This was to many churchmen, this was an intolerable intervention of the emperor into a purely church affair. And certainly it created a lot of discontent, a lot of unrest among the clergy, who regarded Nicholas's unilateral actions as being as ignoring the wishes of the church. A religious ceremony, a religious event for many, connected with the saints, were the feast days. These took place on the name day, on the day of the saint. Each saint had their own day, and that was a day of appointed for some kind of celebration or festival for that saint. Now, because most Russians were named after a saint in the 18th and 19th century, the celebrations, this meant there was such a thing as name days. This was where you would celebrate the day of the saint after whom you were named. So, for instance, let's say your name is Alexei. It's a very common name in Russia. Then that meant that your name day was the day of Saint Alexei of the 17th of March. These celebrations established a personal connection between an individual and a saint, and were yet another avenue for worshipping, for praising the figure of a saint. And in some cases, these saints' days were not just personally meaning, but they were communal. They marked the beginning of certain seasons. For instance, the beginning of the harvest, the beginning of harvest, the beginning of sowing the seeds, and also the end of these periods. Again, we find that religious ceremonies, religious events provide structure to both individual and community lives. They provide structure to the year and not to each year, to the cycle of agricultural work and rest over the course of the year. But the most fundamental manifestation of the worship of saints in the Russian Orthodox Church are icons. And of course, these are the most famous, I think, manifestation of orthodoxy that most people have encountered in some form or another today. And it's pretty simple. An icon is a representation of a religious figure which is worthy of esteem, honor, and prayer. Now, usually these icons could be to a variety of figure and were produced in a variety of spaces. Monasteries and convents often had icon workshops, but then in some of the dioceses there were bigger scale icon factories and so on and so forth. These items could be cheap pieces of paper with the representation printed on it, or on the other hand, they could be huge ornate pieces decorated in valuable metals, in precious gems, painted by celebrated artists, worth huge amounts of money, and everything in between. Now, I just want to make clear, I think this is a fact that has often confronted non-Orthodox Christians when looking at the icons and how people treat the icons in Orthodoxy. As far as the Orthodox Church is concerned, it is not violating the second commandment. Thou shalt not worship graven images. As far as the Orthodox Church is concerned, on a theological level, they are not worshipping the image itself. Rather, the image is a transmitter of the grace of God, either through an image of Jesus, through Mary, or his saints. That is what is being worshipped. It is the essence of the divine transmitted by the icon. That is what is being worshipped, rather than the image itself. Of course, whether most Orthodox peasants made that distinction is highly questionable, but nonetheless, that was the theological position of the church. And indeed, icons were ubiquitous throughout Imperial Russia. In most peasant homes, they had what was called a red corner. And in the red corner, you would find a collection of icons and candles. Often people would turn towards this corner to bow, to make the sign of the cross upon entering or upon leaving the building, upon a momentous event, upon the signing of some kind of contract or making an agreement, and so on and so forth. In other words, the icon is a way in which there is a mobile form of the grace of God. You can put one in your house and therefore have something of the church and its rituals inside your dwelling place. But some icons, in particular, were regarded as rather special. These were the miracle-working icons. And these icons were believed to have special powers, often of healing. Yes, usually of healing, but not always. There were some icons which were regarded as bringing, a special luck or a special good fortune. And such icons were treated with a great deal of reverence and respect. They were placed in important cathedrals, important monasteries and convents, and they also became sites of pilgrimage, sites of worship, bringing in believers both from the local region and indeed, especially towards the end of the 19th century, from across the empire as a whole. So as I said, some could bring, some of these icons were regarded as healing icons, but others were regarded, had a sort of national significance in the fact that these individual icons had brought military success to the Russian state in its various wars over the centuries. One of the possibly most famous instance of this was the Smolensk icon of the Mother of God, which was attributed with various associated with various Russian military victories. As a result of this reputation, when Napoleon, with his unprecedentedly strong army, invaded Russia in 1812, the Russian army marched this icon, the Smolensk icon of the Mother of God, before their troops at the major battle in this invasion, the Battle of Borodino, in September 1812. Precisely to bring in the hopes that it would firstly inspire the troops and inspire the troops, and secondly bring the grace and protection of the Virgin Mary both to the Russian army and Russia in itself against this invader. And often these icons came with a certain story attached. a discovery story. So it was the case that an individual or a group of individuals would have a dream or have a vision of a saint or of Christ or of Mary or some other religious figure. And that vision would lead them to a location where the icon was buried. Then, because of this miraculous foundation, it was established, well, this icon clearly has something special about it. And then from there, usually the miracle stories came surging. Stories of healing, stories of restoration, stories of health, stories of good fortune, coming from speaking to this icon, touching this icon, kissing this icon, and so on and so forth. To give you a local example, I will give the Putitsa icon of the Virgin Mary. This was so the legend has it. This was found by a group of Estonian shepherds who saw a vision of a woman in beautiful, shining, radiant clothing. And when they investigated the sites where she appeared, they found the icon. And then they gave, because they were Lutheran Estonians, they didn't realize the significance of the icon. They gave it to their Russian neighbors, who immediately recognized that, firstly, this is an icon of the Virgin Mary, but secondly, the image, the apparition of the Virgin suggested that this was a holy icon, and so they created a chapel at Putitsa for the worship and adoration of this icon, especially on the day of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, the 15th of August, when a large ceremony was held outside the chapel. Talking then of miracles, well, miracles obviously and clearly play a large role in the religious worldviews of Orthodox believers. And certainly this is something that the Orthodox believers shared. This was a view shared not just by peasants and people in lower classes of society, but one which was shared among all Orthodox believers. Indeed, the theology of the Orthodox Church itself defended the existence of miracles. The Bible repeatedly mentions instances of Jesus and various other figures being subject to or performing miracles. And certainly the history of the early Christian Church repeatedly mentions miraculous occurrences. And basically, a miracle can be defined as the intervention of God in the human world in an event which is otherwise inexplicable by human beings. And again, most miracles do good things. They heal, they bring good fortune in battle, in business, etc., etc. But there are certainly some miracles which are considered almost punishment miracles. For people, for instance, who don't behave Christianly, then some of these miracles are sent to punish those individuals. Now, I've got some examples of both a good miracle and a bad miracle, a punishing miracle, which were attributed to the Russian Orthodox bishop, Saint Iosaf, who was made into a saint in the early 20th century. So if we look at the good miracle, for instance, we see a case of healing. A noblewoman in 1815 was paralyzed by a stroke and confined to her bed. In sort of desperation, her husband placed an icon of Saint Iosaf at the head of the bed, went to the saint's grave, and ordered prayers to be sung there. As a result of these actions, both through the physical presence of the icon and through the worship of the saint at his gravesite, the noblewoman recovered. Certainly, the use of icons in folk medicine is very wide and very prominent. One typical cure for a great many ailments, a great many illnesses, was to hold an icon over the sick person's mouth and to pour water down the icon into that person's mouth. The water then presumably would, as it traveled across the icon, would gain the holy qualities of the icon and thus work as a kind of cure for the sick person who was drinking it. I also here have a punishment miracle. So one legend stated that the priests in the Belgorod cathedral, where Saint Joseph's body was stored, had been selling bits of his hair for money to believers. In other words, a sort of very mercenary, exploitative action. As a consequence, Saint Joseph intervened with God, and God drove the priests mad. Now, of course, this is a legend, but again, it's an illustrative legend. It demonstrates precisely that saints could be both people who rewarded the virtuous and took pity on sinners, but also punished those who contravened Christian teachings, especially if they were priests whose actions here are, in this particular story, are extremely hypocritical. Now, we already see here a distinction between how most people understand, how most peasants understand a miracle, and how the church understands a miracle. For the church, a miracle is not an explainable, predictable, or rational event. It is something that happens through the intervention of God into the world, which is by definition inexplicable. It is unpredictable. It is not reliant on human action or human knowledge. For peasants, however, there is a certain transaction going on with miracles. We can see in some of these miracle beliefs. In other words, by their worship, by their adoration, by their prayers, by their commitments to an icon to conduct certain tasks, certain pilgrimages, give up certain foods, do penances, and so on and so forth, they conceive of this as a payment to the saint. And they, in return, expect the saint to fulfill the duty for which they're being paid. To assist with worldly problems, to provide cures, to provide help in different matters, and so on and so forth. And there are certainly cases when saints did not live up to their side of the bargain, when saints failed to provide the cure, to provide the miracle that these individuals believed they had paid for through worship, through actions, indeed in some cases through giving donations, giving money. And this could, of course, cause resentment towards the saint or that particular saint's icons. So here's a facet in where the where the popular religious mentality contrasted clearly with the theological position. For the theological position, a miracle is something, well, miraculous. A miracle is something undefinable, inexplicable, and certainly cannot be summoned by any human action or force. Whereas for for the popular religious mentality, there is a transactional quality. This resembles, in a way, a marketplace transaction, a purchase of a miracle in exchange for certain behaviors, certain ways of acting. Now again, I want to reiterate that the Church never abandons its belief in miracles, in the miraculous. The Church absolutely holds that this is possible under its theology. However, the world around the Church is changing in the 18th and 19th centuries. Science science as a system for understanding the physical world and for understanding how to produce certain results from the physical world, from conducting different actions upon the physical world and getting certain results, certain consequences from those actions, is ever increasing. And with it, it brings a rationalistic mindset, which tends to suggest that science, that miracles, things that become from beyond nature, from some other realm, from other sphere, from the divine, are impossible because they contradict the basic laws of nature. They contradict things like causality, or etc., etc. Given the prominence of these views, especially in elite, educated society, the Church, therefore, becomes much more cautious about confirming miracles. We already discussed this to a certain extent when we discussed canonizations. The Church basically, in order to launches extraordinarily thorough investigations of miracles. And here is an instance where we often think, it is a common and perhaps even vulgar belief that religion and science are in opposition to one another. But in these investigations, we see something a bit different, in fact, because we see, certainly the Orthodox Church, employ science, particularly medical science, to investigate miraculous recoveries, miracles, and in particular miraculous recoveries. Doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, etc., especially at the end of the 19th century, are dispatched to investigate these miracles for the Church. And the idea, of course, is if they come back with positive results, then the Church can say, in front of secular society, well, these miracles have been confirmed by medical science, and therefore give them a greater degree of believability, a greater degree of authenticity, a greater degree of validity. But of course, the Church's insistence on being as cautious and as thorough as possible might produce certain tensions with their parishioners. Parishioners were often desperate to see miracles recognized, to see their local holy man recognized as a saint, to have an icon pulled into the pantheon of miracle-working objects. For both spiritual and material reasons. But the Synod's demand for thorough checks, thorough to the point of investigations taking years, maybe even decades, of course, could alienate believers who desperately wanted to see their icons recognized. Now, another behavior strongly associated with saints and saints and icons, were monasteries and convents, was the act of pilgrimage. So a pilgrimage is a long journey or trip undertaken to worship at a particular religious site, perhaps a particular icon, perhaps a particular relic, or a particular saint's body. And traditionally, it is supposed to be a long and hard journey, not just physically, but also spiritually. It is supposed to test your commitment to worshipping, your commitment to worship, your commitment to the Christian faith, your devotion to the saint in question, and your devotion to God. The For the vast majority of cases, these could take places, usually took place within the borders of the Russian Empire, which had more than enough famous monasteries and convents equipped with extremely famous relic collections, miracle working icons, and what have you. But for the truly adventurous, certainly there was the most adventurous option. That was to say, to take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, a trip which not only involved walking, but also would require going overseas, required passports and documentation, and could be and could indeed be especially difficult. By the 19th century, with the revolutions in sort of steamships, steam transports between southern Russia and the Holy Land, this was beginning to change as certain companies opened up to provide cheaper transportation for pilgrims to the Holy Land. Various hotels and diplomatic services opened in the Jerusalem and the sites around it to provide services to Russian Orthodox pilgrims. But still, even at the end of the 19th century, to go to Jerusalem for your pilgrimage was a big deal. But what is happening in the 19th century, and again, we have at the end of the 19th century, is we're seeing the modernization of pilgrimage. And again, here is a nice example of how modernization and the increasing rationalization, more technology and so on and so forth, does not necessarily negatively impact religion. On the contrary, it can be deployed in the assistance of religious behaviors, on their expansion. This is absolutely the case with pilgrimage. Firstly, there was one major social change which made pilgrimage a viable activity for huge swathes of the population, and that was, of course, the abolition of serfdom in 1861. This basically now meant that peasants no longer had to seek the permission of landlords in order to travel, but rather obtain a passport. So therefore, they could, if they so choose, if they wanted to go on a pilgrimage, it was much easier for them to do so. But of course, another major factor is the revolution in transportation going on in Russia in the second half of the 19th century. The mass availability of rail transport, the appearance of steamboats on the various river systems of Russia. All of these enable greater and greater levels of pilgrimage. Now, giving you some examples here, sort of the two of the most famous monasteries in Russia, the Holy Trinity monastery in Moscow, which is already a very famous monastery even before the abolition of serfdom and the establishment of railway networks. But it's more than, with these changes, it was able to become a truly huge center of pilgrimage. By the end of the 19th century, it had doubled, more than doubled, the number of pilgrims visiting this site compared to the figure in 1859. Even the distant Solovetsky monastery, an island in the White Sea, very difficult even today to reach, increased tremendously the number of pilgrims visiting. So I've given you here 6,000 in 1863 per year, becoming 24,000 in the year 1900. And this was enabled, by the way, by steamboats operating, the purchase of 2 steamboats by the monastery that transported pilgrims to and fro the island. In the picture here, you can see one of these steamboats picking up and delivering pilgrims. But of course, as pilgrimage became easier and easier and easier, this was changing the fundamental nature of what pilgrimage was supposed to be. Pilgrimage was supposed to be a difficult, arduous task, physically, mentally, spiritually. But now you could just simply get onto a train, and within a few days, you could be at your target destination. Increasingly, this old standard of pilgrimage is now being replaced by something new, a kind of religious tourism, almost. So we see that religion and modern technologies can act in a symbiotic relationship, with both changing the other. Okay, I want to move on to the second half of this lecture now. I think I'm already quite a way in, running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go on to the second half, which is now looking at this sort of category of superstition. Now, we've just spent the first half of this lecture looking at forms of religious behavior which were more or less permitted and encouraged by the Holy Synod and the Russian state. These were Orthodox behaviors and were justified within Orthodox theology and long-established Orthodox practice. But of course, this was not the limit of Russian religious practices, experience, or expression in the imperial period. There were other forms which the church was far more ambiguous towards, and indeed the state was far more ambiguous towards. The reign of Peter the Great had turned the reign of Peter the Great had announced the arrival of rational Enlightenment philosophy into Russia, and consequently, the state-level labeling of certain religious behaviors, certain religious beliefs as superstitious, as beliefs which should not be permitted, as beliefs which had little purpose and little justification in any kind of truth or fact, and that these forms of religious behaviors were harmful to the people conducting them and to the people who witnessed them. It was argued that if Russia was to become a modern, prosperous, and successful state, it had to educate its people to give up these superstitious behaviors which clouded their minds and affected their judgments. This meant that some forms of religious behavior and religious action were now reclassified. They were instead considered by the state to be forms of fraud. Basically, people trying to play on the naivety and ignorance of others for a financial or material gain. And such cases could be criminally prosecuted. Meanwhile, the church itself was concerned about these so-called superstitious beliefs and behaviors. It believed that lack of oversight has allowed these pre-Christian behaviors and beliefs to seep in among the Orthodox crowd, among the Orthodox believers. And that therefore there had to be a campaign to re-Christianize people, to increasingly give them a truer, better knowledge of Christianity so they could distinguish what was a true Christian belief and what was a true Christian action from what was a false superstitious belief or a false superstitious action. And it was this which increasingly in the 19th century pushed, the early 19th century in particular, pushed the church authorities to emphasize on the need for educated clergy to act as teachers. The clergy had to re-Christianize people by educating them about what was a superstition and what was not, and therefore hopefully produce a more rationalized approach to the Orthodox faith. But of course, the peasants, peasant communities in particular, but not just peasant communities, this is very different. Various forms of belief Various forms of magic structure the way they view the world and the way they make the world bearable to live in. Around them was a physical world full of death and danger and disease. This is a world, remember, before antibiotics, before any kind of antiseptic, before anesthesia, etc., etc. A great many of ailments we can easily cure today could kill you. Many sort of common problems which we can solve today within a few minutes or with a simple operation would cause lifelong pain to individuals with very little in the way of relief, except perhaps alcohol or maybe some pain-relieving herbs, which the local wise woman might prescribe. It's a world where the weather is harsh and the environment is harsh. Woods and forests are large, dangerous mazes full of wild animals, especially wolves, which could inflict grievous injury or death. People might rivers, especially during the spring season when the snow is melted, became unpredictable, fast-flowing, with strong currents. Falling into one could spell your doom. By conceiving of these dangers as a form of black magic, as something, a magical force in the world, a magical force of evil in the world, this meant people could take action to contradict the evil. In other words, they could turn to the repository of rituals, prayers, images, etc., belonging to the Orthodox Church to counteract these various evils. And by doing so, they restored a degree of agency to their world. Bloody hell. They restored a degree of agency to their world. By, for instance, performing a cross, making the sign of the cross as you cross a bridge, you can safeguard yourself from falling victim to falling in the river, to being pulled into the river by the demonic forces that would otherwise drag you in. Your cross has driven off the demonic forces that would drag you in to the river and drown you. In other words, your action has allowed you to assert some power of your fate. And this is why peasants engage in a magic field, have a magic field conception of the world. It is something that gives them agency, that gives them the ability and power to assist them in their everyday lives when confronted with a world so full of dangers and death that they otherwise cannot control. And there are various manifestations of this belief in magic. One of the major ways is the belief that magic could be directed by particular individuals, and it could be used for either good or for evil. And one of the major individuals, the individuals that could control and direct such magic, were witches and wizards. Now, there were some distinctions in the Russian tradition of witchcraft from the Western European one. For instance, in the early period of the early modern period, so between 1500 and 1700, most Russian witches were not women, but they were men. This is a clear difference between Western Europe, where the vast majority of cases were witches were victims victims of witch hunts were women rather than men. Often these individuals who were assigned this role or considered to possess this role were people who already stood outside the limits of the community in one way or the other. So the people who are old, who are therefore closer to death, the widowed, people who lacked, or people who had never married. In other words, people who lacked a firm family life. Foreigners, people from the medical profession, disabled or disfigured. In other words, people who stood outside the normal limits of the community. And there were various ways in which one supposedly could become a witch. One might be trained, one might be born, or simply given the role by collective suspicion. And certainly some people did desire to become witches. After all, they may wish to direct good or evil forces in favor of or against a particular target. And again, all of this stems from what I just talked about, is the belief that the world is filled with magic, which can be directed both by humans and by other forces. So I've got here an example of a witch, a male witch, in fact, in Ukraine, Mikhailo Chikharev, and the process he undertook when aged 19 to become a witch. So basically, he renounced the Christian faith by removing his crucifix and placing it in his shoe for a long period of time. He then recited a prayer not to Christ, but to Satan. The cross was placed upon the wall. All of this combined gave him the ability to harm others by whispering their name over some salt. And you can see here, again, I talked about the idea of how Christian rituals were the ways in which a person could deploy protection in this magical world, could deploy holy, the sacred, good magic, for lack of a better term, to defend themselves. Here we see how those rituals could be inverted or disgraced in order to produce the opposite effect, to produce malign power that would allow someone to harm another person. I think we'll skip that. Now, one of the major changes in Russia is the fact that, as I stated, the state increasingly regards some behaviors, particularly belief in magic and magical systems, as superstitious. It regards them as frauds. Witches and wizards who sell their abilities to others are engaging in fraud. They're deceiving naive, stupid, ignorant people and charging them for the pleasure. So basically, by the end of the 18th century, the witchcraft trials going on in Russia are no longer directed against the supposed witch as somebody who is conducting evil, blasphemous acts. These trials are being conducted against the witch because the witch is a fraud, is someone who is deceiving and stealing from their communities on the basis of ignorant, stupid, false beliefs about their powers. That is why we can still find witchcraft sort of trials occurring in Russia even into the sort of middle of the 19th century. This is not because they are being, burned at the stake for being a witch. They're being tried as fraudsters, people deceiving others. Now, we typically today, I think, often think of witches and wizards sort of being assigned negative roles in their societies, but certainly this was not always the case in Russian peasant communities. Witches and wizards could have a positive social role and could indeed be required by peasants for various ceremonies or for various actions. One of the main sort of portions was the idea that witches or wizards could defend, for instance, a marriage ceremony, defend it from malicious people who might, malicious forces who might wish to seek misfortune or harm to others. This shows you that peasants did not react in one way to witches and wizards. They were not necessarily considered evil figures who had to be driven out or somehow stopped. In some cases, their forces were required. And this meant, of course, that there were actions other than violence that a victim of witchcraft might undertake. One of these could be simply paying off the person. And perhaps we see there why indeed the state regarded sort of witchcraft as a kind of fraud, as fraud. But certainly acts of violence against witches in village communities are going on and on until the end of the 19th century. I've given you some examples here. The fact that all sort of accusations of witchcraft that we know about between 1861 and 1917, 48% of these cases end in violence against the witch. A couple of examples. So 1879, a 50-year-old woman near the city of Novgorod was burnt to death by 200 angry peasants because she had been bewitching and therefore supposedly killing her neighbors. And then we find in 1891 a 73-year-old woman beaten to death in the streets of her town near Moscow because allegedly she had been causing impotency at weddings over the course of a decade. Basically, these women are being turned into sort of scapegoats for general social ills within the society. They're regarded as people who are directing misfortune against members of the community, who therefore have to be dealt with. But again, you see, by assigning an agency to the evil force, peasants are able to deal with it, even in the most violent and horrendous way. This gives the peasants agency, rather than simply saying, "Well, this is misfortune, the way of the universe. Nothing can be done about it." Instead, this is a form of agency being acted by these witches, which in turn can be countered by a peasant agency. Another belief rapidly labelled as superstitious in the 18th and 19th centuries was that of demonic possession. Now here the church was a bit more circumspect because demonic possession was, in their view, theologically possible. The Bible discusses instances of demonic possession, as do various canonical texts of the Christian faith. And it was something that was directly associated with witches. Witches, in other words, could direct demonic forces to occupy another person and cause a variety of sicknesses. I mean, here are some of the behaviors that were typical of the so-called klikushki, the screamers, the wailers in Russian. So screaming and shouting, swearing, hooliganism, blasphemy, and throwing themselves around. Now I'm going to give you a good primary source description about this in a minute. What truly caused this is, well, of course, it's very difficult to say from the perspective of over 100 years later. Very likely some kind of psychological illness or social contagion. But also it could have a role in the society. By acting in this way, a person would gain attention, recognition from others, perhaps therefore relieving them of an otherwise marginal or ignored position in that community. So as with witchcraft, we see a transformation in the status of demonic possession. In 1721, under the influence of Peter the Great, demonic possession is no longer considered a consequence of black magic or witchcraft. It is instead considered criminal fraud. And the people being prosecuted aren't going to be witches, it's going to be the women who throw themselves around complaining that they are being demonically possessed. Again, the law code basically conceives of, well, these are actions these women do to obtain money, to obtain charity, etc., to obtain attention. They are defrauding the community with these false beliefs, these false actions, and therefore they are subject to criminal action. This idea of witchcraft, of demonic possession being fraud, changes in the late 19th century. when the arrival, particularly, well, first of the medical profession as a whole, the modern medical profession, but especially the arrival of modern psychology and modern psychiatry, increasingly begins to define this as a sickness. And increasingly define it not just as any kind of sickness, but as a particularly female, a uniquely female sickness, something to do with the weakness of the female body or the weakness of the female mind. This is their perspective. I'm going to emphasize their perspective on what it was causing this. So basically we see a transformation over the 200 years in how this belief, how this form of behavior is treated. Demonic possession goes from being an act of witchcraft, creating a victim, to a case of fraud, where the person claiming demonic possession is in fact the criminal, and the people around her are the victims, to finally a form of mental illness, especially female mental illness at the end of the 19th century, which is diagnosable and treatable, apparently, through modern psychological treatments. So then, just to give you a final case study, I think we're running desperately out of time, so I'm going to be brief. Basically, in this case, in Oshepkovo, in the 1890s, where a community dispute led to an outbreak of demonic possession, not just in one woman, but in several members of the community. And so basically this case revolves around two women, Vasilisa Alexieva and another woman, Siklitina. Basically, a wanderer came to town. The wanderer was murdered. The husband of Siklitina was one of those involved in the murder. He was arrested and imprisoned. Siklitina blamed Vasilisa for the imprisonment. Of the husband and for having caused the murder in the first place. I should mention that Vasilisa gave bread and accommodation to this wanderer, which is why there was some blame heaped upon her. Basically, after increasing stress, increasing declines in her social reputation, Vasilisa experienced a seizure in the church, rolling around and screaming that, in fact, she had been cursed by Siklitina and had been subject to demonic possession. These seizures continued for 2 years, becoming even more numerous, becoming even more intense. Even dispatched to a convent to seek a cure for the illness was to no avail. Meanwhile, in the village, this demonic possession seemed to spread. 15 more women and even 2 men. And it was typically assumed that demonic possession was a female affliction at this period, in this period of Russian history. I mean, men had earlier been afflicted with it, but in this period, it was generally considered a female illness or a female affliction. But in any case, this demonic possession and its consequent seizures seemed to spread. And of course, the village community now turned increasingly against Siklitina and her family. They were attacked on the streets, despite having a previously good reputation locally. And in fact, they ended up being driven out of the community on the advice of the local authorities, who suggested she relocate to Moscow, because essentially she was being blamed as a witch for causing demonic possession, and therefore she might be subject to attack, possibly even to death, to prevent any further outbreaks of this. However, her removal didn't end the case, which resulted in the Ministry of the Interior taking interest and dispatching an official psychologist to try and investigate. Now, to conclude the lecture today, I just want to give you a nice quote from the land captain sent to inspect this case and to report on it, because he gives you a very nice sort of a description, well, a harrowing but very notable description of what a sort of case of mass demonic possession supposedly looked like in late Imperial Russia. Initially, their faces and eyes twitched. They jumped up and down on the bench. Then came a frightening shriek, which caused them to go into a frenzy, tear at their clothing and hair, and throw themselves from the bench onto the floor or under the table in the hut. They struck their heads against the boards so hard that I was afraid that several of them would smash their skulls. During their fits, their strength was so great that 6 strong peasants could not restrain one ill woman, who tore herself from their grips and struck her head under the table. Thanks to the presence of 40 peasants, we prevented them from mutilating themselves. After the fits, the ill women were like corpses. All of them were almost without a trace of life. Their faces were ghastly white. They were lying down with their eyes closed. Their breathing was almost imperceptible. So indeed, I think to have been present at one of these instances must have been a truly terrifying experience, particularly for those who did not necessarily possess complete educations or a great deal of medical knowledge. And I think with that, I'm going to conclude today's lecture. I know I'm deeply running out of time. So if my students could possibly read the 2 concluding slides, so to give you an idea, a summary of what we've talked about today. And for everybody else, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you all next time when we will be discussing women in Russian Orthodoxy.